My name is Shreyas and I'll be explaining how oxygen is carried in our blood. So, as you can see by the title, hemoglobin carries oxygen. What is hemoglobin? Hemoglobin is a protein composed of 4 polypeptide chains. 2 of these are alpha chains and 2 of these are beta chains. So, each of these chains contain a heme group, and a heme group contains an Fe2 plus ion. So this Fe2 plus ion can bind to an oxygen molecule, and this is what enables hemoglobin to carry oxygen. So each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen molecules, as there are 4 heme groups. So where is this hemoglobin present? As you know, our blood is composed of red blood cells, or erythrocytes in other words. So these erythrocytes are basically bags of hemoglobin molecules. And so you might wonder, isn't the oxygen carried by the hemoglobin, isn't that used by these RBCs for respiration? So the answer is no, because RBCs don't respire. They don't actually have functioning mitochondria which perform respiration. Their organelles have become inactive over evolution. Nature has designed it in a really smart way. So they can efficiently carry oxygen from the lungs to the tissues and backwards. So yeah, that is how hemoglobin is carried. But so we know now how hemoglobin is carried, but why is it carried? Why does oxygen end up in the RBCs in the first place? So the answer to that is, let's come to the lung area. So in the lung area are these sacs called alveoli. Alveoli basically take up the oxygen from the air. The lungs take up the oxygen from the air, and that oxygen is there in the alveoli. Now these alveoli are surrounded very closely by blood vessels. These blood vessels actually absorb the oxygen. And this absorbed oxygen is then basically transferred to the RBCs, because the RBCs are there in the blood vessels. So why does this oxygen enter the blood vessels or capillaries? So first of all, the partial pressure of oxygen is very high in the alveoli, because it's basically just oxygen. So because of this high partial pressure, it enters the blood vessels and hence is absorbed. And inside the blood vessels and inside the RBCs, it is then bound to the hemoglobin. And that is how it is then carried forward to the tissue area. Let's talk a bit more about this binding process of oxygen to hemoglobin, which basically forms oxyhemoglobin. So this binding process is actually a cooperative binding process. What does that mean? So cooperative binding is basically like, so hemoglobin earlier is this protein. Now actually the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin is unfavorable initially. The hemoglobin is in a conformer called the 10th state. So since the partial pressure is high and all, there is a high probability that the oxygen would bind to the hemoglobin, even though it's a bit like unfavorable because of the conformer. Anyway, the first oxygen would have a hard time binding, but once the first oxygen binds, this conformer changes to something called the relaxed state. And in this relaxed state, it is easier for the oxygens to bind to the hemoglobin. So the following oxygens would basically have a very easy time binding. So this is basically known as cooperative binding. Okay, so now we discussed all about like the lung area. Now let's come to the tissue area. In the tissue area, oxygen is transferred from the hemoglobin to the tissues for respiration purpose. What the tissues do is they absorb oxygen and they give out carbon dioxide as a byproduct of respiration. So naturally the partial pressure of O2 is lower and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is higher. Uh, so this so let's discuss about why oxygen leaves the hemoglobin in the first place in the tissue area. So one reason is obviously that the partial pressure of oxygen is low and hence oxygen is sort of demotivated to stay in the RBCs anymore. So it leaves. Another reason is because of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is present in the form of HCO3 minus ions and H plus. So this H plus actually binds to hemoglobin to form this molecule, and this actually competes with the O2. So when H plus binds to hemoglobin, O2 is kind of motivated to leave now. This is the second reason, and the third reason is that CO2 directly also binds to hemoglobin. So this changes the conformer of hemoglobin so that it is unfavorable for the oxygen to stay. This is sort of like the anti-cooperative thing for oxygen. So yeah, oxygen leaves in the tissues. So that is basically the reason of why oxygen is transferred to the tissues and now can return back to the lungs along with so now it is transferred to the tissues and now hemoglobin can return back to the lungs along with CO2 and H plus. Now again in the lungs the process that I previously explained is repeated. Oxygen is motivated to now enter the red blood cells and both of these are kicked out. So that is how oxygen is transferred. Now so let's come to one important thing, that is why is hemoglobin preferred over another protein called myoglobin. So myoglobin is also known to store oxygen really well, but so look at this sigmoid like curve of hemoglobin. Let's understand its significance. You can see that for varying amounts of partial pressures of oxygen, the oxygen saturation is more or less constant here. So for organisms whose oxygen partial pressures are like varying, the saturation levels would still be high, and this is a good thing for survival. But in the tissue areas, the oxygen needs to be transferred, hence it needs to leave. So the oxygen saturation needs to decrease, and hence this sigmoid curve goes down. So this is perfect for oxygen transfer. Now let's come to myoglobin, a protein that stores oxygen really well. Now what the twist is here, that even though it is storing it really well, this is bad to transfer oxygen to the tissues because it would not willingly leave the oxygen. And yeah, that is basically not fit for transfer of oxygen, even though it is good for storing. So this entire discussion of hemoglobin brings in an important disorder called sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia is a genetically transferred disease, and what that does is the patients face difficulty in the respiration because their oxygen levels are really low. Now let's come to why this happens and how this is related to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin comes in like variants. So there are healthy variants known as hemoglobin A, and there are unhealthy rare variants which are known as hemoglobin S. This is the sort of faulty, this is a byproduct of the faulty gene that is inherited, which gives rise to sickle cell anemia. So what is the difference between these two? The difference is of an amino group. One of them contains valine, whereas the other contains glutamate. Yeah. So what the difference is in hemoglobin S? So in hemoglobin A, there are two extra negative charges because of the side chain of the amino group that is different. So due to the, and here these two negative charges are absent. It's like two neutral basically instead of that. So what happens here is a sticky hydrophobic area is formed due to these two absent negative charges, and that basically makes this hemoglobin molecule, a deoxygenated hemoglobin molecule, insoluble. And these insoluble deoxygenated hemoglobin molecules stick together and form like long chains, which basically aggregate, and these cause the RBCs to gain a sickle-like shape. And this RBC basically becomes unfit for oxygen transfer, and hence the oxygen levels go down. Not only that, this also hinders the path for normal RBCs to transfer oxygen. So this causes pain in the patients because of this hindrance, and their oxygen levels also go down. So that is how sickle cell anemia is related to hemoglobin. And that concludes our discussion about hemoglobin and oxygen. So keep enjoying science. Goodbye for now.